Welcome to a very stressed Connected Leadership podcast host, and thank you for joining us. For the second time in 2 weeks, we're half an hour late. I can only apologise. Technology has let me down in a different way again, and the last half hour has been spent cursing, yelling, screaming, trying to reach support on Facebook forums, but eventually we got there. So, big smile on. Back in the room, and hopefully you're still with us. I have no idea what the event title says, because once I miss my scheduled slot, I lose the event. But you are here for the Connected Leadership Podcast Live, and we're going to be talking about imposter syndrome. Right now, I know exactly what it feels like. So if you haven't watched one of these before, I'm Andy Lapata. I'm guessing you know that. It says my name just above all of this. I'm the host of the Connected Leadership Podcast, which broadcasts on Mondays and Thursdays on all the usual podcast platforms. And what I've started doing over recent weeks is recording or streaming the recording of the podcast live. So we stream 2 podcasts. The first recording takes about 45 minutes, and that's an interview on a theme. Today the theme is imposter syndrome, and then we go smoothly and quickly, almost seamlessly, into a second interview, which is for our Thursday podcast, which is a much shorter one, where we focus on the theme of professional relationships, because the premise that underpins the Connected Leadership Podcast is that professional relationships underpin executive success. So let me tell you a little bit about today and our guest today. As I said, the focus today is on imposter syndrome. It's something that comes up time and again. When I'm mentoring people, it's very quick to spot where people don't feel that they're worthy of having a conversation with certain figures that they need to build relationships with. They don't feel that they're the right person to deliver a presentation. It could be a range of different things. I'm probably not the right person to tell you exactly what imposter syndrome is. That's why I invite experts onto the show. But it does come up time and time again. So I knew that this was a topic that I wanted to explore. And I've got 2 guests to explore the topic. The first guest is Sajna Rahman. Sajna is someone who I have known for a number of years. She was mentored by one of my earliest guests on the podcast, Vanessa Vallely. And I met Sajna when she was ripping up trees working for Sodexo, the big facilities management company, and getting everyone there to network like crazy. About 18 months ago, Sajna took redundancy and set up her own business as a speaker, and she's working predominantly with women, not solely, but predominantly with women, teaching them to network, but also talking about her imposter monster. So that's my first guest. And my second guest is Caroline Flanagan. Caroline's the author of 2 books, including her second book, which ironically is called Be the First. And it's all about imposter syndrome, and also looks at imposter syndrome from a diversity perspective as well. And Caroline and I have met on a few occasions. I wouldn't say we know each other that well, and I'm looking forward to getting to know Caroline better over the course of this conversation. But everyone I know, when I talk about imposter syndrome, Caroline's name is the person who comes up as the go-to person. So she was the person I went to come and join Sajna and I in this conversation. So Sajna, Caroline, thank you very much for joining me on the Connected Leadership Podcast eventually.
We got there. Thanks, Andy. It's great to be here. Hi, Sajna.
Hello.
So let's start out. I said in my that I'm not the right person to say what imposter syndrome is. I haven't studied it to the degree that you have. So Caroline, tell us what imposter syndrome is for those that haven't come across it before.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So I love imposter syndrome because it's so easy and clear to define. So it is the feeling that you are a fraud, the belief that any success that you have where you are right now is all down to luck. And there's that constant anxiety that any minute now somebody will tap you on the shoulder and expose you as the fraud you think you are. So if any of those elements you resonate with you can identify with, then that's a sure indicator that you have some form of imposter syndrome.
And Sajna, tell us about your imposter monster.
Right. I think, imposter syndrome is something in my corporate career. You heard about it a lot. And when I experienced it, and that was when I transitioned from being employee into entrepreneurship, that's when I call it a monster attack, and I reframed it. So one of the things that I see imposter syndrome, I have to be careful. It's another, to me, it's another label, and it's all part of our belief system. So I reframed it as a imposter monster, just recognizing as it's an inner critic, inner guide, and it only appears when I'm about to grow. And that's is from a personal perspective that I took an interest in wanting to know more. And it's and before you mentioned about everyone suffers from it. Absolutely, for me, but when I suffer from it, it's very often that you feel so alone. And that's one of the interesting things that I found, that we all know everyone suffers from it, but when you do have that attack, we always feel alone. So reframing that as a positive thing, it's really like enabled me to sort of like share my strategies with other people. So imposter syndrome is like imposter monster is like a fun way of communicating it to others.
So you say that it came up a lot of the time when you were working for Sodexo. Have you both found that people are very aware of this in the corporate space, or are most people suffering from it but not recognizing it or not putting a label on it? What was your experience, Sajna?
For me, like, I rised up the career ladder pretty quickly through networking, through leveraging relationship. I don't have a degree. I don't have so as I've approached leadership, qualification in terms of having an MBA and all that stuff were coming into like my space. I felt like as if I can't go any higher if I don't have an MBA, if I don't have letters after my name. But really, that was the belief that I was telling those stories myself. But at the end, it came down to the fact that, yes, I was good with my soft skill. I was good at influencing and my impact within the organization, that they created roles for me, and I was the networking internally and externally as well, increased my like personal brand. But then when I had that moment of the next step, that's when it would come. It's like, how did I get here? I'm going to get found out. And so it's things like that used to I like experienced it, but I experienced it more so doing what I'm doing now. That it crippled me, really crippled me, because I was totally out of my, whoa, I'm an entrepreneur. Oh my God! But as an employee, there's so much safety around. Like, you've got a team, or there's so much things for you to sort of utilize to manage it. But when you're on your own, you're on your own.
So let's pick up on that. Caroline, is there a difference between imposter syndrome and simply that natural discomfort and fear when you step beyond your comfort zone and you push your existing boundaries? How do the two differ?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question, because there's a kind of healthy form of self-doubt that we all experience at those times when we're pushing ourselves a little bit beyond our comfort zone. And I hear quite a lot, Andy, in my work, like, so, what's the big deal about imposter syndrome? Isn't that just normal? Don't we all experience it? A particularly interesting conversation I had about this was when Vanessa Feltz did a feature of it on her radio show. It was shortly after Michelle Obama, when she was doing her tour. She'd come out and talked about, how she still suffers from imposter syndrome. So on the Vanessa Feltz show, there were so many people calling in and saying, "Oh, it's just normal self-doubt. You get over it. It's humbling," really downplaying the significance of imposter syndrome. And I actually went on that radio show because I was really keen to acknowledge quite how severe and quite how challenging and different imposter syndrome is and can be for a lot of people compared to your normal self-doubt. So one of the perhaps the defining characteristic for me, is that when you experience sort of healthier self-doubt as you're about to step out of your comfort zone, When you experience that and then you achieve something, let's say you achieve your objective or you get your promotion, you go up a level, what tends to happen is you feel better, right? So you doubt you can do something, you do it, and then you think, oh, I've just done it, I feel better. What's very different with imposter syndrome is that the more you achieve, the worse it gets, because the thinking behind that is, oh no, I've used up another bit of my luck. I'm even more of a fraud. I'm even more likely to be found out. So that for me is a really key differentiator. If achieving what you set out to do makes you feel worse instead of better, then that is a key indicator that it's imposter syndrome, as opposed to what I would separate out as kind of a more healthy form of self-doubt.
So I'm just going to take a quick pause to just say, if you're commenting or sending questions, to go with my theme of technology failing me today, I can't see your comments. There's an error loading comments. So everything's going wrong this afternoon. I've got lots of self-doubt, so apologies for that. But please do post them. Post your questions, post your comments, tag Sajna, tag Caroline. I'll see them anyway, and I'll tag them in the post afterwards. And hopefully, if you guys are open to it over the next few days, if people have specific questions for you, you'll come back and address them. That would be great. So given what Caroline's just said, Sajna, you shared how leaving the security of your corporate role, becoming an entrepreneur, taking each step has left you with that doubt. Have you found yourself, as you've achieved something, are you questioning it straight away, or are you able to enjoy the achievement? And I know that you've run a workshop recently for Muslim women, for example. How did you feel after that succeeded? Were you questioning the success? Were you asking, could it have been better, or were you able to revel in it? And the various steps you've taken, and I know you've taken a number of steps in the 18 months since we had that dinner in Pizza Express and you were contemplating that first step. How have you felt at each moment of progress?
So, first of all, it was my decision to leave my secure job because I had validation. Now, I've had a side hustle called Tomorrow Meets Today, and that won an industry recognition. And it was and my organization that I work for was also shortlisted. So that was like, wow, I am really great at bringing people together that would not normally meet. So when I left, and that recognition was kind of really powerful, that it was the decision that I needed to make was made for me. You need to do something, because that inner niggle that I got when I approached 40, and I loved bringing people together. And you would remember that event that I did for for networking for university students from the Netherlands. And I loved just bringing people together. And when I did make that move, automatically I got my first opportunity to speak about networking in Saudi Arabia. And I remember that conversation that we had. So I wanted to be a speaker, I wanted to make events, I wanted to do all that. Everything was so exciting for me. So I did actually take a quantum leap. And then 2 days before going out to Saudi Arabia, I was like crippled in the middle of a cafe, bawling down with tears, thinking, what just happened? I am actually going to Saudi Arabia. I can't talk about networking. My topic was, the workshop I was going to run was the power of networking. And here I am, just like crying. I can't do it. They're going to laugh at you, Sajna. So all those inner things, that was really, when I say crippled, I mean, it must be because tears were boiling down. So then after calling a few people, and you were one of them, you reminded me of what I had achieved. That's when I came out with collecting your receipt, and we always need those reminders sometimes. How could I not talk about networking? I've award-winning networking event, and I had a successful career because of how I leveraged networking. I'm constantly told how brilliant I am in networking. So for that imposter to come at that stage to like pull me back was like, was mind-boggling, like, for me. But what you talked about, the things I've achieved after being hit by coronavirus, we can't do live events anymore. Speaking industry, I was amongst loads of speakers who were saying everything is being cancelled. But because I already made that decision of I want to get to a certain area, be a speaker, be an events organizer, coaching came naturally to me. So as I was supporting many people fast tracking their career through networking, coaching was the next step for me. And that's when, by having that group of support network, has helped me progress more. So then I became an online coach, and then the rest is like, when going online, the opportunities is just like amazing. Now I've actually got a business. I've got an online business, and sometimes I have to pinch myself thinking, wow, how did this happen? But I'm much more at ease with it because I know I'm growing. I've reframed what imposter monster means, and I also
and we've
the fashion talk about that experience.
we
My
just
talk
lost
was around that, so
we just lost you for a second towards the end there. Sorry about that. But yeah, you were saying your talk was around that whole area.
Yeah, with the competition speaker factor, I spoke about the imposter monster, and one of the it's I came second in the regional one, but it just gave me such a great feeling that I can actually speak about my experience, and if it helps other people, it's okay. And what Caroline said earlier, it does get worse, but the thing is, we cannot eliminate it, but what we can do is minimize it and be okay for imposter, whatever it is that comes inside, to manage it and minimize it and replace it with positive affirmations and positive achievements that we can actually show the receipts.
I'm going to come to how we can manage it as well. I want lots of practical tips from the two of you in terms of how to deal with that a little bit later. It's interesting, Sajna, when you share your story about how you were in Saudi Arabia, because one thing that always strikes me is that as a speaker and as a podcast host as well, I think when people see these lives, it's the same thing. It's a bit of a cliched analogy, but it's like the swan, where everything seems really calm and you seem perfectly in control on the surface, whereas under the water you're scrabbling around. The half hour we were meant to be broadcasting today and weren't is a classic example. The expletives that were springing from my lips. And when I present, I'll if I'm speaking at a big event, I'll be sat in that audience with all types of challenges to my ability to be on that stage and my worthiness to be on that stage going through my mind. When I share that with people, they don't believe me, because when I'm up there, I seem very self-assured. On that note, we've got comments back, and Simon Raybold has said, so self-doubt is to imposter syndrome as feeling depressed is to clinical depression, in that the two people, says it allied the two things. I don't know if Simon's sharing a word I've not come across before. That wouldn't be unusual with Simon, making me feel I'm not worthy of having a conversation with him. So Caroline, what Sajna's shared there about her experience, what Simon said there about the conflation between self-doubt and imposter syndrome and so forth, you've painted it as something much stronger and much more prevalent, with what we do, much more destructive than self-doubt in a way. Would that be fair? Are there cases where people think they have imposter syndrome, but they have natural self-doubt that can be easily overcome?
I would guess the answer to that is yes. And the reason why I'm laughing, Andy, is because in a way, I don't really think it matters whether we call it self-doubt or imposter syndrome, and kind of where, there's going to be overlap. They're both, two ends or on the same spectrum. For me, the value of calling it imposter syndrome comes back to what Sajna said right at the very beginning about that feeling of being really alone. And that is something that when we can identify how we're feeling with this thing called imposter syndrome, that feeling that there's a name for it, that it's a legitimate feeling, that you're not just going crazy, and that it's something that other people have experienced. That feeling that, oh gosh, I'm not alone, is for me the most important reason for calling it imposter syndrome and giving it its own unique label. And then to the other point for me is that actually, whether it's self-doubt for you personally, whether you call it imposter syndrome, really what matters is what the impact it is having on you personally, and what solutions are going to help you or serve you the best. You know, there are lots, and as you said, we're going to talk about the tools and different tips and techniques that you can apply if you're experiencing self-doubt or imposter syndrome. For me, I think there's a point at which your everyday tips and tools of just kind of telling yourself you're good enough don't necessarily work. And I'm talking about my own personal experience here, where the sort of the troubleshooting and the putting a band-aid on it at a certain point becomes quite exhausting, because you're, you know, feeling constantly like you're back in the same place every time you try and get another step. So for me, if you're at that point where the normal day-to-day tips and techniques aren't working for you, then that's when it's a kind of more severe, if you like, potentially destructive form of imposter syndrome that may require a bit more in terms of a solution and a strategy for you.
Right. Well, let's talk about your personal experience then, because Sajna shared hers. One of my favourite stories that I checked with you beforehand and confirmed was my good friend Jeremy Nicholas has been working with you, and you've just published a book about imposter syndrome, and you said to Jeremy that you weren't sure you were the right person to write this book. Classic example of it. So tell us a bit about your own journey with imposter syndrome.
Yeah, so and I love you know, a big high five to Jeremy. I'm sure he's listening either now or he'll listen to the replay. That was a very poignant moment for me, and I'll come back to that really, because it kind of is where I'm at right now. But just to fill in the detail of the journey, and going back to your question about, you know, the experience of imposter syndrome in the corporate space. So I worked as a lawyer in the city for 9 years, and I suffered terribly from imposter syndrome, but I had no idea that was what it was. It was a very private, very lonely battle. And it was only after I left and I started coaching and speaking and being much more educated about what goes on in our brains when we're under pressure, and our identity and all that stuff that also supports my coaching business, did I discover that it's a real thing and that it's called imposter syndrome. So my experience of it is years and years growing up, suffering from it, but not knowing what it was. And then from the point at which I discovered it, it was incredible, that feeling of I'm not alone, it's a real thing. But then began that kind of constant search for the solutions for it. And I would say that, you know, I tried things like calling a friend to get the boost, to be reminded that I'm doing really well, or I can do it. And even, you know, your power posing or all those different strategies, but none of them, for me, it was, as I've said, none of them really worked in a way that I felt was moving me on in how I felt about myself, how I could trust myself to show up to challenges. And then ultimately I had a crisis point, not unlike actually Sajna's, when she was talking about going and delivering this event about award-winning networking and your imposter monster, Sajna, making its appearance. And it's like there are those critical moments where it feels like imposter syndrome is going to get the better of you. And for me, that's happened twice. The first time was after, ironically, related to publishing books. I'd be interested, Andy, to see if you've had that experience. But the first time I had written my book, I think I naively thought that being outside of the corporate space, I would feel much more confident, you know, outside of of the kind of high pressured competitive environment of city law, that I would be more relaxed, more confident, and able to do what I set out to do. But actually publishing my first book created an absolute crisis in me. I literally got to the point of the equivalent of pressing send, right, on an email. I got to that point and I just couldn't do it. And it felt for me as if all of the years leading up to that point of little experiences of self-doubt and imposter syndrome along the way had all mushroomed into this one experience, which meant I got to a point where I thought, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep getting to the brink and then having, you know, Sajna's description of her breaking down and the tears. I can't keep getting to that moment. I can't keep doing this to myself. I don't know how much longer I can do this. And for me, that was the real turning point of, I need a bigger solution. I need something that speaks more to my relationship with myself and who I am. So that was the first crisis point. And then the second one, to come to the story that Jeremy will have told you about Andy, writing the book, ironically, a book about imposter syndrome. I've been speaking as an expert. I'm paid to speak and educate and coach people around imposter syndrome, and have been for about 7 years. I'm also a person of color who has, learned to succeed and find my way in a essentially white corporate world. So here I was writing a book about imposter syndrome, about being a person of color in an essentially white corporate world. What is it about that I would think didn't equip me to write the book? But ironically, that's exactly when I had like my second biggest crisis moment. And here's why. I was writing as a person of color about being in a white world. And for me, that topic triggered so many memories of growing up from the age of 6, being the only Black child in an all white school, and being like that. I see as the kind of the seeds of my imposter syndrome were sown then. My experience there, and effectively I've had to navigate that white corporate world my whole life. And at a certain point, while writing this book, as the person of color, very proud person of color I am, I started to question my credentials in being the one to talk about the experience of a person of color, the experience of a Black person, the experience of a person who's navigated and found success in a white world. All of those questions came up for me. But here's why it was amazing, Andy, is that questioning and the imposter syndrome that was triggered in that experience, what that revealed to me was exactly why I was the perfect person to be writing that book. It was exactly because I have grown up, learned to live, learned to thrive and succeed in a white environment as the only person of color in the room. That's exactly what has equipped me and made me, I think, uniquely positioned to write that book. So I think that's a really amazing illustration of how what triggers your imposter syndrome is often this clue, an invitation, an opportunity to step into exactly what it is about you that's unique, that makes you perfectly positioned to take that step that you're afraid to take.
Bao Nanray on LinkedIn has said that she can resonate with what you're saying perfectly as well, and I think it's really reaching out to her as well. And I know the book it's not just about imposter syndrome. As I said in the introduction, it's about how it impacts people of colour as well. And you both are, women of colour. And I would be interested to know, do you think that imposter syndrome affects people of colour more than it does white people? Do you think that it affects women more than men? How is it impacting different groups in different ways? Sajna, you're a Muslim woman who's also worked in a corporate space and also as an entrepreneur. How much do you think your gender and your race have had an impact on the way that you have accepted or rebuffed the successes that have come your way?
Right. For me, I want to speak to what Caroline, she raised a really important point. It's that turning point. And for me is when I really started to really invest in myself within my belief system. So it goes back to things that I've been programmed with. And one of the things, the more you are self-aware of yourself, you can manage it better. So I wanted to really, that has been something that has been pivotal. Once knowing that, I was able to manage it. But to your question around, has it had an impact? When I remember my first job, so I had, I don't have a college education. I got married very young. My son is now 27, so I stepped into the world of work coming from a Bangladeshi community. I went to a school that was all nearly 100% Asian and Muslim. Muslim. So coming into the like corporate world, I was excited. I was really excited, and my role model actually was a Scottish woman who had this travel bag, and she was going around the countries, coming from LA to here. So I saw that as I could be like that. I didn't actually see like any like difference between me and her. She's just higher up. So that's when I had that mindset, that confidence was there. So as I went higher and higher, people started to talk about glass ceilings and things. So I didn't know it existed until people put it in my like mind. And the fact that you are Asian, you are Muslim, but that came as I was climbing up, when I was getting into more senior position. And that's when I went into the world of D&I. I don't know how it happened. It's probably because I was just really confident. And that's when I started to champion, underrepresented. The information that I know now, looking back, I would do things so much differently, because I was fighting a battle and just focusing on what the problem is. Oh, there's only 1% of black. I was just focusing on that. But knowing what I know now, there's much better way to influence. There's much better way to build confidence in Black and Asian like communities, and that's what it comes down to. It comes down to the confidence. And when I'm working with people live, with Muslim women, with Asian Black people, that's what we start with. What is conditioned within you from childhood, really, and the limitations that we actually put in ourselves from what's spoken about like externally. So all that like knowledge came afterwards, when I started to look into myself and build my confidence and pull out all the roots of the BS that was being like shared like to me. So just to end there, what I love about Caroline's book title, Be the First, I don't like the word when they say you can't be what you can't see. I became what I couldn't see. I saw a white woman with, her lifestyle inspired me. So, what I say, be the first, you don't, representation, of course it matters, but I think the narrative that we are using now can be detrimental. So invest in building up people's confidence. And you know me, Andy, I've championed a lot of awards that is exclusively for Asian women, for Black people, but I think there is a bigger conversation that can be had in really investing in building the mindsets of people, of how we deal with situations, around conversation around diversity. So I love Be the First. So that's that's me.
And it's a lovely point that you became what you couldn't see, and I think it's a great way of encapsulating that. And Bal's on your side as well, Sajna, saying totally agree. Watching on LinkedIn. So Caroline, Be the First. Tell us about where the book title came from, how it impacts, and where did you've touched on this in your previous answer, but where did the choice come from to write a book not just about imposter syndrome, but about how it impacts people of colour particularly?
So thank you, Sajna, for and Andy, for embracing the title, really recognising the importance of that title. So the idea for the book, I tell you honestly, I wasn't planning to write a book on imposter syndrome. But I reached a point in my career, in my business, where I was, great, fantastic clients, a lot of global organizations. So I was being invited in to deliver keynote talks on imposter syndrome, and in very high performing environments like law firms where you wouldn't typically expect to find it. So it was really incredibly fulfilling. And as you will both know, any great speaker will share the relevant personal stories that are relevant to the topic and that are going to inform the message for the audience. And so I found myself after a certain point realizing that I was talking to an essentially completely white audience, about my experience of imposter syndrome as a woman, as a person of color, as a human being. And that I just had a deep sense that while my story resonated hugely with my audience, and I know this because they told me, there was another layer to it. It was so much more to it than me having been the only person from a really low socioeconomic background in my school and going to Cambridge and then going to a law firm like Allen Overy to start my career. There was something additional about being the only, one of the few women that like stayed on, had children, stayed in a law firm. There was something additional about being the person of color and everybody around me being white. So there were all these layers, which now we talk about, call it intersectionality. And so it's, as I'm standing there and I'm delivering these talks, and there was one day, Andy, where I looked out into the audience and I saw just in, not far from the back row, I saw a black face. So this is how I describe it in the book. This is how I describe it when I talk about it. I saw a black face in a sea of white faces. And it really struck me because at a certain point in my talk, I talk about being the only person of color in the room and in an all white school. And that is my metaphor for it. That's the analogy I use, that I was a black face in the sea of white faces. So one day I'm on stage and I'm looking out and I'm just literally seeing the mirror image of my experience. And I thought to myself, that person, that black woman in the second row from the back, who's sitting here surrounded by all her white colleagues, when she leaves the room, how she feels when she goes back to her office and she's still surrounded by all her white colleagues is so different to how her white peers are going to feel when they go back to their office. So they go back thinking, oh, I've connected with my other white peers. We've got this similar experience. We've had, we know what imposter syndrome is and how it connects us. And then they can take away that new learning, that new sense of being connected and not alone. But for the one person in the room, for the black face in the sea of white faces, when they go back, they're still alone. That difference is very real, very acute. And that, for me, was the moment when I knew I had to write about imposter syndrome, not just to keep talking about, there's lots more about imposter syndrome now. There are more books, there are so many more surveys. But I felt that the experience, that loneliness, that particular more aggravated form of imposter syndrome needed to be not just written about, but I needed to speak to that lonely person in the audience. They are the ones who I felt I could bring real value with my story and with my expertise. And then just to finish off the answer, in terms of the title of Be the First, a bit like Sajna was saying, the language we use is so important. So if we're saying you can't be what you can't see, if you're saying there's no one like me, I'm the only one in the room, what does that do? Where does that put you? It leaves you feeling powerless, feeling like a victim. And for me, that's just an experience I had at a very young age. And I was very intentional about not wanting that to be my life, not choosing that. And every step I've taken to reach the point I have in my life and career has been about not staying in that position of powerlessness, but always finding something there, some way in which I can take ownership, right, of what I achieve and where my career goes. So the title Be the First was it was a kind of an epiphany moment of thinking, you know what, we're not the only ones in the room, we're the first in the room. Because when you go from being the only one in the room and you step into being the first one in the room, the whole energy change, everything about who you are in that room changes. Everything is different. You have a much stronger sense of what you're there to do, of the impact that you can have, not just on your own career, but on those who might follow you, on those around you. It's a much more empowering stance. And that's the message that I wanted to send with this book.
And I've got a feeling that when we talk about the practical steps that we can take to overcome imposter syndrome, that reframing is going to be a core part of it. But before we do, I want to pick up on something Sajna said. Because Sajna said, you talked about it was only when other people pointed things out that imposter syndrome started to hit you a little bit. Before that, it was, that was just the way of the world. How much of this comes from other people's influence, from other people saying, why are you doing that? What gives you the right? What, why are you sticking your head out? How much of our imposter syndrome comes from other people telling us what we can't do? Sajna?
Yeah, I think like it has a lot to do with that. For example, I was full of confidence. I believed I can do. Just an example. I believed I could like carry on like going forward. But I think when the example of a glass ceiling, you know, that I never knew existed. But because I was networking with like women's group and those groups have been a huge benefit for me because I met so many diverse women in a similar problem that I believe, looking back at what I know now, if I look back how I accepted a lot of things that probably I didn't need to. And those things that I accepted chipped away at my confidence. And that's when the imposter comes in. Because, oh, it's validation to my what I can actually achieve or not achieve, and then it comes down to what I struggled with. Or Sajna, you're full of like enthusiasm. If you've got too much enthusiasm, they're not going to take you seriously. So there's no gravitas in you, Sajna. No one likes to talk all those like little things that like come in, and that's something that I struggled with, to get that gravitas to be heard. But what I didn't realize, people were hearing me already. People loved my messages. People loved all those things that I was saying, championing them. But what was getting me down is that one person that would say something negative, like, who does she think she is? I would just focus on that. And what that told me was my self image wasn't right. I could be confident from a negative realm within, and that's when I started to look. It's all about the self image, it's all about how we see ourselves. And when I knew the power of that, that's what I want to do to help others. And I just quickly want to say um, about the Eastern women and Western women. What the interesting dynamics that I found, um, the event that I held last week, I wanted to get a group of my Western women with my Eastern women. So these are women from the Middle East, South Asia, and in discussion, what I've noticed is that Eastern women feel inferior. It's a natural thing. They feel inferior to the Western women. But what was magical was the Western women were sharing the same issues around confidence, same issues around self-image. So that was beautiful for me to see that we are all the same, really. We are all the same with the same issues, and we're all trying to navigate, our confidence, within ourselves. So I guess the work has to be down to like your self-awareness and the inner work to be done. And I want to answer the question to what you said about male and female. There may be studies that says women suffer from it more than men, but I believe that we all suffer from it. And I think sometimes when we genderize things, it doesn't help. It doesn't help, because I know you suffer from it. I know my son suffers from it, but it's a real thing in everybody's life.
Yeah, I there's so much I want to dig into here, and I don't have the time. There's so many ideas streaming from what both of you are saying that I think we could go deeper into, but we are coming towards the end, so I can't do that. But I'm pleased you said that. I would be interested in the stats. I do wonder whether women would report it more, but I wonder how much of that comes to the tendency to acknowledge these things between the genders rather than the actual suffering from it. I want to talk about the practicalities, and I want to pick up on something that you've just said, Sajna, and that is, one of the things that I hope to achieve from this particular episode of the podcast is that people recognise that imposter syndrome is a thing, and that their feelings of not being worthy or not being the right person doesn't mean that they're not worthy or they're not the right person, and they're not alone in that feeling. That's for me where I would start with handling anything like this, is to normalize it and make sure people feel that it's not, they're not weaker because of it. They don't stand out because of it. Caroline, what are your top tips we've talked about that. We talked about reframing. What are your top tips to if once you've identified you could be suffering from self-doubt or imposter syndrome, starting to take action to get beyond that?
So I'm going to be unhelpful and say I haven't got any top tips, which is not to say I'm not going to answer your question. So it comes back to, Andy, what I said about really reaching a point where for me, the more day-to-day and the tips and stuff just wasn't working. So what I say with my clients is that, look, there are lots of things that you can do, lots of things that people will advise you do, and you can try. And if they work for you, that's fantastic. Where I come in and see the opportunity to add value is where those tips don't work, and it requires something deeper. And Sajna has been referring to this the whole way through about the relationship with yourself, and that self-awareness. So for me, and again, touching on the reframing point, for me, it's stopped being about getting rid of your imposter syndrome. I don't think that is the point, or that's really even possible. I certainly don't know anyone who has got rid of their imposter syndrome. Do you, Sajna? No. Anyone? No. Andy? Anyone who's got rid of it?
No, not springing to
mind.
So
there's a lot of talk over, how to get rid of it, how to ditch it, how to overcome it. I think we're missing the point. I think what matters most is, okay, when you are experiencing imposter syndrome, what are you making it mean, and what do you do about it? What do you do next that allows you to still step into the power of actually the value, either your valuable self? So what I like to do with imposter syndrome, both in myself, because of course I still experience it, and in others, is to say it's not actually a problem we need to fix. It's a puzzle that you need to solve. So every time, and this is my tip, my advice, is that when your imposter syndrome is triggered, know that that's just a question in you about who you are being at the moment. Who are you, and who are you showing up as in this moment? Because most of the time, let's face it, whether it's just before you go on to give a talk, Andy, and by the way, that's me, in the half an hour or so, certainly the night before, doing a big talk, terrible imposter syndrome, all sorts of stuff in my head. Like, what are you doing in those moments to get you through those feelings and enable you to show up and then give the best performance you've ever delivered? And the answer is who you are. But in order to be able to answer that effectively in a way that gives you courage and confidence and helps you show up, you need to have done the work beforehand. You can't go searching for the answer to that when you're in the thick of a high pressure situation, when your emotions are running high. For me, and I get my clients to do the work, do the work now, so that every time you face that kind of challenge, you have kind of at your fingertips the tool that reminds you of who you are in your entirety. So how do we do that? So for me, I created an imposter speech, and I help my clients create and craft their individual, unique, very specific imposter speech, which encompasses everything about them: their past experience, their values that drive them, the successes they've had, the failures that they've learned from, everything about who they are. And with this kind of speech, that it's a speech because you want it to be accessible, you want to be able to bring it out at any moment. It immediately puts them in the state where they can say, this is who I am. When imposter syndrome comes up and it says, who are you? You can come back and say, I'm Caroline Flanagan. I am, the ex-lawyer who spent 9 years at a big city law firm. I'm the owner of this big business that works with this caliber of clients. I was the person who got in, first one to go to university in my family, and it was Cambridge University. I was the only person in the room for 90% of my career. So all of that stuff, which when I recall it, emboldens me, empowers me. And by the way, it's not just the successes, it's also the times when life was really hard and I had to dig deep and be resourceful and climb my way out of really difficult situations. I want to bring all of that into my speech too, so that in those moments where that question is asked of me, who are you, as you're about to step on stage, as you're about to do something really challenging, I have the answer. I know the answer, and it comes from the entirety of who I am and not just from what I'm thinking about myself in that moment.
That's brilliant. And again, so many questions in my mind that I want to dig into, but no time. I want to ask for a quick one on this. How do you strike the balance between those who need to come up with that imposter speech. They need to remind themselves who they are and of their achievements, but they have people in their life that tell them, don't get out of your box, don't, stay down. Who are you to brag, who are you to boast? How do you counter that?
So first of all, the imposter speech is for you and for you only. It's not an elevator pitch where you're going around telling everybody how great you are in 60 seconds. If you create your imposter speech and you never share it with anyone, but you internalize it yourself, it is every bit as powerful, even more powerful, right? Because it's for you. So that's my first point. And it's interesting you mentioned bragging, because I was actually coaching a client on this last week where, and the client is from a European country where, they're very understated, very, it's not cool to brag, to talk up your achievements. And I said to her, and I'll say this to anyone else who's worried about this, there's no law against bragging to yourself, right? That's the bragging, if you want to call it bragging, that's really important. It doesn't matter if you can't say it to everybody else. You get the power from how you feel about yourself, and how you feel about yourself comes from what you tell yourself that you're capable of.
Love it. Sajna, what do you do on top of that to handle imposter syndrome?
I absolutely agree with everything that Caroline has said. Affirmation is really powerful when you're looking at improving your self-image. But what I want to share, my strategy that I run last year after we were accepting my imposter monster, I ran a campaign called Draw Your Monster. So what that was on social media, what I got people to do is draw their monster and write down 3 negative things that monster is telling them. So it would be like, you're not good enough, who do you think you are? They are going to laugh at you. So those are the 3 main ones. And what I found, and then on the opposite side of the monster, I wanted people to write down what opposite of what you're saying to yourself. So basically, you are good enough, and you can do this. And it was run on social media, and I found there were some scary monsters that people drew, and I thought it was a fun way to actually get it out of your head. So there is scientifically backed evidence when you get stuff out of your head, and when you see it's out, and you can work with that. So I just found it empowering, for me. I need to share that. And it was there's no age limit. I think we can suffer from imposter monster from a really young age, and I've got my nieces who's 8 and 10 to get involved as well, to draw their monster. And it got some traction, and what I found is it was just really interesting to see what the monsters of people are saying, and the pictures illustrated how scary it was. I mean, my monsters, it's not that bad, but I think sometimes it really and I just wanted a fun way to engage that. So that's what I do, with my clients as well. Just draw it out, and exactly what Caroline saying, script it out, say it out, and it's all about what you say to yourself that really builds the stories that we tell ourselves.
That's brilliant. Perfect. And yes, yeah. I've got Scary Monsters, Super Creeps going around in my head, David Bowie song at the moment. So you'll have to dig that one out, Sajna. I have one really quick question that I really want to get to. I think it's so important. So Caroline, I'm going to come to you with this one. The podcast is called the Connected Leadership Podcast. We've focused on imposter syndrome for the individual listening to this. But of course, as leaders, it will affect us as leaders in 2 ways, ourselves and the people we lead. How can leaders recognise that their charges or anyone else in their network is struggling with this, and how can they help them?
Yeah, look, I think there are 2 things. There's the recognizing it or thinking you can see it. So one thing about imposter syndrome is it's so hidden. Okay, so it's not always totally obvious when somebody is lacking that belief in themselves. So I wanted to say, don't make the assumption that just because someone appears confident on the surface, like you, Andy, you appear really confident, as you say, you have those imposter moments. So don't make the assumption that because they appear confident that they are, and that there isn't any self-doubt. So I think with whoever you're dealing with as a leader, it's your responsibility to always be looking to be supporting, challenging, testing the people who look up to you to fulfill their potential. And then when you see that reticence, when you see that self-doubt coming through, and again, it's those behaviors, the fraud, the thinking everything's down to luck, I shouldn't be here, suggesting everybody else go for a role or seize an opportunity when you know it should be then. That's how you can identify it. It's actually, you start to see a pattern of them playing small. In terms of how you support them, I always say you can't solve somebody else's imposter syndrome for them. But what you can do is hold them a little bit more accountable to themselves. We've already shared tips about what the work that individuals kind of need to do. And it's not for you to suggest they go away and work on themselves. That's not the point. The point is, I think, to create the space in which you challenge them when they're not stepping up in the way that you know that they are capable of. Say, what's going on here? So I think it's about actually just being able to have a conversation, encouraging a conversation around their reticence, but crucially, being able to share yours. As a result of all three of us sharing our imposter experiences today, we will be more connected to people out there who have imposter syndrome. So a willingness to talk about your own experience and your own moments of self-doubt is going to be absolutely key for inspiring and supporting those who are in your team.
Great stuff. Thank you. Bal, I haven't had a chance to get to your other comments, I'm sorry, but Bal has said, I recently joined the NHS Patient Advisory Board and noticed I was the only person of colour, and I have actually challenged the reasons for this. The response was shock, but the directors took notice, and I can see improvement slowly and not just a tick box exercise, which is great. And then a little later she said, you need to embrace and learn to move forward side by side. But Bal and anyone else with us, stay with us. I'm going to do a quick goodbye for the Monday episode for the podcast, and then we'll move on to our Thursday one. If you're watching and you've got any comments or questions, feel free to post them as well. But this is just for the podcast for now, so don't run away. So that's a great note to end on. Caroline and Sajna, you're going to come back on Thursday and tell us all about your professional careers and how your relationships have impacted you. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having us, Andy. It's been a pleasure.
It's Andy, that's it. Bal said thank you, great session. There's more to come, Bal, so we're going straight onto it. That really was great. I was looking at the clock and I'm going, I've got so many things to ask and it's all running away, but I think that'll be a really great episode, so thank you. So we've now got the 3 questions that you know about. So I'll edit straight in on the first answer. So I'm trying to remember who opened up. I think Caroline, did you open up this one with the definition? You did. Sajna, I'm going to come to you first. So Sajna, can you tell us a bit about the role professional relationships have played in your career to date?
The professional relationship that has helped me, impacted me.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I was fortunate to have great bosses and not so great bosses. When I look at the people that were in my support system within the workplace, learning from the negative and the positive. And yes, there's one particular relationship that unfortunately he's not alive today, Michael Collins. It's that belief in me, and I thrive when I have people believing in me. So there's been several relationships like that within my career, and I think to your Caroline's point earlier, is when you have leadership like that, nurturing your talent in that way and really believing in your capability. You may not be there now, but knowing where you can go, that has had a real impact on me, and I've taken on board as well all the information that's been shared with me, even though I didn't necessarily believe it, but I loved the fact that someone had confidence in me. So I was kind of borrowing their confidence in me and just doing what I needed to do. And obviously, as I went further on in my career, coming into the world of entrepreneurship, loads of people have impacted, and particularly with my personal boardroom that I've collected by networking throughout. So there's not like one relationship, but it's the relationship that I chose within my close circle that has really like impacted me.
The theme of the belief others place in you has come up more than once in the podcast with this question. I think it's a really important one when we look at the relationships we can forge as leaders. Being able to show belief in the people that we lead can make a huge difference to them, and that's come up time and again on this. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to come back to you shortly and find out about the negative ones as well, because we don't let you off those. As you say, we can learn from those as well. So Caroline, how about the positive ones for you?
So if I think of my professional corporate career, I definitely felt the absence actually of senior leaders who I felt kind of believed in me or noticed me. And I think that's quite a common feeling as a kind of lone person of color in organizations. It's one of the challenges is how do I get the supporters, the mentors. But outside of that, so outside of the corporate environment, I'd say there's two things, two types of relationship that made the difference. And I think both they both have in common is what we've talked about, which is an ability to see in me more than I could see in myself in a particular moment. One of them is, bizarrely, I mean, the people who influence us come from the strangest places. An ex-boyfriend's father, who was a very senior lawyer at a time when I was just thinking about going into the law. And I remember having a conversation with him about how out of place I felt and not believing I could do it, and how just alien the environment was. I came from a very different background to all of my peers. And I remember him just saying to me, I mean, this was over a course of a period of time and we'd chat about my aspirations. And he would say, but of course you feel out of your depth. Of course you feel like this. Of course it's an alien environment. Look where you came from. Look at your, your heritage. Look at the challenges you've had to face. And now you're going into a white corporate world. Of course you feel unusual. That's a sign that you are on the right path. That's a sign that it's exactly where you should be. And I remember him saying that and it making it seem like, oh, yeah, actually, this doesn't mean there's something wrong. This means I'm on the verge of something, and it's really important that I stay on track. So that meant, I can't tell you how impactful that was for me. It was about 28 years ago. So that's how much of an impact it's had. Other than that, I would want to acknowledge, however, also kind of peers. I was going to say competitive peers, because I'm a strong believer in you are the company you keep. And when you surround yourselves with people who you can relate to, you're connected to, but who are pushing as well, right? Who are aspirational as well. They bring you up. And I've always found that so true and so powerful. So I like to keep good company with people who I see are successful, who are striving. And I find that just having relationships with them, a bit like in a mastermind type scenario, Andy, that makes a massive difference to my belief in what's possible and keeping going.
Yeah, there's that famous phrase about you are the sum total of the 5 people you spend most of your time with. And I think, that has to be used in context, but it is a good guide. Are you surrounding yourselves with people who are going to pull you forward, who are going to challenge you? And I have 2 masterminds and 2 accountability groups because I want to achieve that. And I've got people who push me and pull me at the same time. And I like the point about validation as well. It's easy to miss, but having people that can say, yeah, you are on the right track and you are doing well. And of course you're struggling with that. That's understandable. Just to give us that sense check and to refocus on where we are on our journey and stop beating ourselves up a little bit. And going back to our main theme on Monday's podcast about imposter syndrome, having those people around us that can remind us that we do deserve to be the person doing what we've been asked to do. Can make a whole lot of difference with that as well. So that's the positive. Let's have a look at the relationships that haven't gone so well, and as Sajna said, what you can learn from them as well. So Sajna, you said you've had a few. Tell us about 1 or 2 of them. You don't have to name them, by the way.
No, but it's really important because guess what? The negative impact makes you that much stronger, makes you that much more determined. And that's like what I've learned like from it, because I wasn't accepting whatever negative things that was like said. Those are the comments that really get you like your emotions going, and whatever triggers negative triggers within that they like bring alive, that gets me like fired up to show people that I can do it. That's where that fire in the belly comes from. So really the negative comment is probably the driver. And what I want to also bring it down to, I remember what Caroline said earlier, who you are, what you've been through, where you come from. When I start looking at who I truly am, where I'm from, what I've been through, the negative comment suddenly becomes, I've been through worse. This is not, it just makes me want to see even more. and that's what I want to say. So I thank them, from like the bottom of my like heart, that because of them I'm here where I am now.
Fantastic. Very, very constructive and positive attitude. And Caroline, how about for you?
So when I thought about this question, I had understood it. The way I'd read it, Andy, was more that relationships that hadn't been successful ones and what I'd learned. So I actually hadn't thought about relationships that had a negative impact on me so much as ones that hadn't worked out.
You can go down that, is how you interpret it. That's absolutely fine.
Yeah. So and the reason maybe that's what triggered that was so recently someone on my team, we've decided to part company. So I've got a team of a few people, and she's a very impressive woman. She's worked really hard for me for the last year and a half, and she decided to stop working for me. And it was a real surprise, because I do pride myself on having good relationships, well, with anyone in my network, but especially with the people who work really hard for me. So it was I've had just literally in the last few days a chance to reflect on, what was that relationship? What went wrong? What could I have done differently? What did I learn? So to that point, what I discovered was how important it is to be able to part company with somebody, particularly someone you work with, if that's the right choice for them and it's the right choice for you. Actually, the reason for her leaving was for the very clear reason that what I now needed was not what she was able or willing to provide. So it was about kind of, sometimes relationships come to a natural head, and it's not that we no longer have the relationship, but maybe the relationship changes. And I think there needs to be, for me, there's a learning in the fact that relationships evolve, and sometimes who you are to each other. I mean, this happens with romantic relationships too, right? I mean, in all sorts of relationships, who you were to each other yesterday might not be who you are best positioned to be to each other going forward. So that was a really key point. And then the second learning for me was to look, particularly as a leader, to look at how other people are relating and communicating with each other. So you could be as careful and constructive with your relationships as you want, but if between members of your team there isn't the same care taken, then that can lead to, that can undo the culture that you might be trying to create. So very important, I think, to ensure that your approach, this is my learning that I'm sharing from this experience, to approach your leadership style and relationships you build to, I guess, to ensure that flows down and really support those who you work with or who you spend time with to follow the same approach and the same principles. That would be my lesson. I don't know if that is helpful from the point of view of that question.
I'm sure it is. It's we're getting a whole range of tips on the podcast as answers to these two questions, and the idea is that people who are listening on a regular basis go away with ideas that help them as they develop their careers and then lead their teams or lead their networks, and all of this is very relevant to that. So that's great. Final question. You'll be glad to know it's been a marathon session covering the two podcasts. So the final question is looking at the resources that that have had an impact on you, that stood out for you. So it could be books, podcasts, TED Talks. We've had hip hop lyrics. We've had magazines. So wherever you want to take it, what's really stood out for you? Caroline, do you want to kick off with that one?
Yeah, sure. Always books. I mean, I love a podcast, but always books. So I try to read voraciously. What comes to mind for me, I read a lot of non-fiction business building books, which as an entrepreneur, entrepreneur are just so important for keeping you, getting you through those challenges and believing in the process. So the author that stands out for me right now is Cal Newport. So a few of his books I really love. I love So Good They Can't Ignore You, Digital Minimalism, and then there was the third one, Deep Work. I think was another one, which I've just found fantastic. So those books have been really powerful for me recently. And then podcast-wise, all the greats. Your Tim Ferriss, for example, love his interview style and the quality, the caliber of guests that he gets on, to name just one of so many that I love to listen to.
Great. And Deep Work, by the way, it's come up before. That's probably the business book that's had the biggest impact on me in the last few years. Changed so much of the way I work as a result of that book. And I'm no longer a big reader of business books. I'll read them occasionally, but I tend to try and escape a little bit and get my inspiration from elsewhere. But I did a business accelerator course with Baiju Solanki over 2019-20, and we had reading we had to do every month, and Deep Work by Cal Newport was one of those. And the writing style didn't get me, but the content did. The ideas really did. Sajna, how about for you?
For me, it's more people, but I will refer to books because it's all around books around the power of the subconscious mind, psycho-cybernetics. So anything to do with the mind, I've been really fascinated with, and it also helps me build content for what I want to teach, because when I that sounds, the whole piece on self-image, for example, I never knew about that when I was in the corporate world. I never knew the mechanics of how it all works. So, the information around 97% of what we believe is from our subconscious mind, and our subconscious mind doesn't know the difference between reality and what's real. So why wouldn't we tell our subconscious mind that we are brilliant? So when I looked at things like that, I started to delve into that. But of course, people and the network that I have, the mastermind and groups that I have, has been a huge help to keep me on track. And of course, your book, Andy, just ask, is a reminder of all the great thing. And I look forward to getting your book, Caroline. It sounds like a fabulous book, and it would be great to learn more about that.
Brilliant. Well, Caroline and Sajna, thank you so much for joining me. The two podcasts have been absolutely fascinating. That book by Caroline is Be the First. It's just come out, I believe, and you can grab that from all good bookshops and some not so good ones as well. Thank you so much for joining us on the Connected Leadership Podcast, live but a little late. And I hope that you found this enjoyable. Thank you, Simon and Bal, for your contributions as well. I'll be back again soon. I haven't checked my diary yet again to see what the next interview is. But I think if I remember, I saw the 16th, which I think is next Friday. I believe I have Paul McGee, the author of Sumo and Self-Confidence and How Not to Worry. Good friend of mine, a brilliant author, brilliant speaker. It's going to be a very upbeat interview. Great fun. Think it's the 16th of April. Keep your eyes open for that. Hopefully we'll be on time as well. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us on another live broadcast of the Connected Leadership Podcast.